Imagine a race series where there is basically no rule book, where you can pretty much build any kind of car that you want. Well, from 1966 through to 1974, the Sports Car Club of America did just that. It ran a championship to FIA Group 7 sports car regulations. It was called the Canadian American Challenge Cup, better known as the Can-Am. Now, the Can-Am was the biggest, craziest, loudest racing show on earth, and from it came a whole bunch of creative monsters. But one of the most memorable of them all was the Chaparral 2J from 1970. And that's really saying something, because this car only ever raced 4 times. Now, history shows that McLaren was the most dominant manufacturer in Can-Am history. From a total of 9 championships, McLaren won the series 5 times. And from a total of 71 races, McLaren cars won 43 of them. The Kiwi racer Bruce McLaren loved the Can-Am. In fact, he loved American sports car racing in general. You see, success in the Can-Am in particular helped to fund his growing McLaren Cars company. Now, in 1962, when he was a factory driver for Cooper Cars, McLaren shared a Maserati-powered Cooper Monaco with Roger Penske in the Sebring 12 Hours, and he was so enthused by the whole experience that when he got back to England to Cooper Cars, he asked if he could be put in charge of Cooper's sports car program. See, he could see huge potential for Cooper Cars selling a bunch of cars into the American market. Unfortunately, Charles Cooper flat denied his request, but fortunately, Bruce McLaren went off, started his own race team, and then eventually started building his own cars. Now, Bruce McLaren was a really clever engineer who recognised great ideas when he saw them, and he combined other people's ideas with his own. But in many ways he was actually quite conservative. In fact, he was kind of the polar opposite of Jim Hall from Chaparral Cars. Now, the brilliant Hall introduced a bunch of pioneering concepts to the Can-Am. He also enjoyed really close ties with Chevrolet, and Chevrolet produced the technology that helped him carry out many of his ideas. Now, some of his concepts were so advanced that they hadn't even made it to Formula One yet. But unfortunately, pioneering concepts sometimes come with snags. You see, Hall's Chaparral cars contested the Can-Am from 1966 through to 1970, but in that time only took one single victory. The very first Chaparral was a front-engine car designed and built by Dick Troutman and Tom Barnes. But everything that followed was pretty much of Jim Hall's own concept. There was the Chaparral 2A, the 2C, the 2E, the 2G, and a 2H, which were Group 7 cars. And then there was the 2D and the 2F, which were Group 6 cars, which ran in the World Sports Car Championship. And it all culminated in the 2J for 1970. Now, of all the Chaparrals, the 2J was probably the wildest one of the lot. But here's the thing, it wasn't actually a Chaparral designed car. It was a Chevrolet concept called the Suspension Test Vehicle. Now, the STV was conceived in 1968 and pushed through for the 1970 Can-Am to replace Hall's difficult Chaparral 2H. And at first, Hall wasn't at all keen on the STV because, of course, it wasn't one of his own creations. But it arrived incomplete at his workshop in September 1969. And 2 months later, after a whole lot of development work, was running test laps at his private racetrack, Rattlesnake Raceway. And although there were a whole pile of issues to still work through, it lapped as fast as any Chaparral had done before. So now, as you'd expect, Hall was starting to warm to it. And with further development, the STV became Hall's next Can-Am challenger, and it was named the 2J. And in case you're wondering, there was no Chaparral 2I. Now, the concept behind the Chaparral 2J or STV was that it produced incredible cornering speeds, but not in the traditional form of applying downforce to bodywork and wings. Instead, cornering speed was basically achieved by sucking the car to the ground. You see, when a vehicle is moving, air enters it in different areas. Now, it can be under the nose, inside the engine bay, inside the wheel wells, inside the cabin. And the faster it travels, the more effect that air has on its handling. But if you can control that air and how much air actually enters the vehicle, and if you then control how much air is exiting the vehicle, and where it's exiting and how fast it's exiting, and then you manipulate that air to create a vacuum while it's within the vehicle bodywork, then you can effectively suck the car to the ground. Now in many ways the Chaparral 2J was actually quite conventional. It ran a big block Chevy V8 with alloy block and mechanical fuel injection, and that was backed by a Chevrolet design and built 3-speed automatic transaxle with a torque converter. So this was the same basic setup that Chaparrals had been running since 1967. The front suspension used wishbones with coils and dampers, which was similar to the 1969 Chaparral 2H. And the rear suspension design was similar to the Chaparral 2E, which became the 2G. So that was all pretty normal too. And it had an alloy monocoque chassis, which most modern sports cars did by that stage anyway, except for the Porsche 917. But from the point behind the front wheels, the chassis was designed as a box structure, and it was really strong. And that box-like shape dictated the bodywork. I mean, the Chaparral 2J looked like a giant tissue box. But then, it all started to get a little bit wackadoodle. At the very rear of the chassis were a pair of 17-inch fans from an M109 howitzer tank, and driving the fans was a 274cc 2-stroke Rockwell JLO snowmobile engine. So the 2J had two engines. Now the rear bodywork, including the rear wheels, was all enclosed. See, the idea was to get the bodywork as close to the ground as possible to create a seal. So at the lower points of the side and rear bodywork were skirts or curtains, but these were mounted to the suspension rather than the bodywork itself, so they maintained a constant gap of about ½ an inch to the ground, no matter what the car was doing. Now Jim Hall said that 1/4 inch actually produced a better seal, but the skirts kept hitting the ground and kept getting damaged. There's also a 4th skirt mounted behind the front wheels and on an angle. And the skirts were all made from Lexan polycarbonate, so they were really strong and they could cope with sometimes whacking the ground. So here's how it all worked. When the little JLO motor was started, air was sucked into the rear box section via a series of holes in the bodywork. The JLO motor then fed that air back out through the two fans in the rear. This effectively sucked the car down onto its springs and created the ½ inch gap to the ground. And because the air was exiting faster than it was able to enter, this was all being controlled, remember, it created a low pressure area or a vacuum. And this was a form of ground effects. Now obviously, if the seal was somehow broken, or the little JLO motor stopped working, then the suction effect would also stop working. But when it was working, it worked everywhere on the track, unlike a traditional wing, which becomes more effective the faster the vehicle is travelling, but is almost useless at low speeds. But the 2J enjoyed maximum suction effect all the time, even at rest. The 2J was often referred to as a suction cup, which is a kind of a fun way to describe it, but it's probably more closely likened to a vacuum cleaner. And if you look at the basics of a vacuum cleaner, you can actually see the similarities. You see, a vacuum cleaner is made up of 6 basic components. There's an intake port, an exhaust port, an electric motor, a fan, a porous bag, and a housing that contains all the other components. Now obviously, the 2J traded the electric motor for the JLO snowmobile motor. And there was no exhaust port because the fans acted as the exhaust port. And obviously there was no porous bag, but otherwise the concept was quite similar. And in fact, everything that was sucked into the box section in the 2J was spat out the back through the fans. And that was part of the problem. You see, following drivers were complaining that they were being hit by track debris. But that wasn't the only problem. In May 1969, the FIA announced a ban on all moving aerodynamic devices. And I quote, "Any specific part of the car which has an aerodynamic influence on the stability of the vehicle must be mounted on the entirely sprung part of the car and shall be firmly fixed while the car is in motion." This, of course, followed a spate of wing failures in Formula One. But given that the 1969 Can-Am was about to start on the 1st of June and that most of the cars had already been designed with moving aerodynamic devices, it was decided that suddenly removing them might actually make them more dangerous. And so the Can-Am ban was moved back until the start of 1970. And herein lay the Chaparral 2J's problem. You see, Chaparral's rivals said that 2J used moving aerodynamic devices. But Jim Hall argued that it actually used a static pressure device and that it was just as effective when the vehicle was sat still as when it was travelling around the track. In the end, the protest went right the way to the FIA, and at the end of the 1970 Can-Am, the Chaparral 2J was banned. And that was it, it never raced again. And Jim Hall walked away from the Can-Am. You know, it's fascinating the impact that the Chaparral 2J had. It's one of the most instantly recognisable race cars of all time, but it only ever raced 4 times. In fact, even that's not quite true. It entered 4 races, but it only started 3 of them. It didn't win a single race. It only finished once, and it finished 6th. But its potential scared the hell out of Jim Hall's rivals. The 2J made its race debut in round 3 of the 1970 Can-Am at Watkins Glen, and Jim Hall actually convinced Jackie Stewart to drive it. It had a bunch of new car problems, as you'd expect, but Stewart still managed to qualify at 3rd behind the factory McLaren duo. Now, Stewart didn't finish the race. The Chaparral broke quite early on, but he did set fastest lap, and the 2J cornered quite noticeably faster than its rivals. It didn't reappear again until round 7 at Road Atlanta, and it had a whole bunch of new upgrades. It was being driven now by Vic Elford. And Elford qualified fastest by 1.26 seconds. And this was the first time in 26 races since Riverside in 1967 that anyone had out-qualified the factory McLarens. In the race, the 2J suffered various problems with its suction system, and Elford went on to finish 6th. Its next race was in round 9 at Laguna Seca, and this time, again with Vic Elford driving, qualified fastest by 1.8 seconds. Unfortunately, the big block Chevy broke in pre-race practice and there wasn't enough time to replace it, so Elford was a non-starter. The Chaparral 2J's last ever race was the final round of the 1970 Can-Am at Riverside Raceway. And once again, Elford qualified on pole, this time by 2.2 seconds. But again, the 2J was struck down by mechanical issues and Elford didn't finish. And that was it. Jim Hall never got to race the car again. So, just how good was the Chaparral 2J? Well, given the Can-Am allowed massive creative freedom, the cars naturally got quite a lot faster every year. But let's compare Vic Elford's 3 pole positions from 1970 and carry them straight across to 1971. He'd have qualified 2nd at Riverside to Denny Hulme's factory McLaren M8F by half a second. He'd have qualified 2nd at Laguna Seca to Peter Revson's factory McLaren M8F by just 2/100ths of a second. But at Road Atlanta, he would have actually taken pole by 3/10ths of a second. So yeah, the Chaparral 2J was good. Actually, it was very good. In fact, it was so good, it had the potential to rewrite history. But of course, we'll never know. Anyway folks, that's it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed this, and if you did, please hit the like button and the subscribe button, and we will catch you next time. Cheers!